I'm a cemetery groundskeeper. This woman made me rethink my career. I currently work as a cemetery groundskeeper. My duties include things like cutting grass to make sure it doesn't grow too tall, planting grass over graves, trimming trees, and the like. I don't typically need to deal with people unless they ask me for directions to a grave or directions to the exit. I took this job for a few reasons. One being that I only have a high school diploma, and I can take this job as it requires that. Two is most of the time limited human interaction. Three is that death is inevitable. We must all die someday. It's just a fact. I don't mind being surrounded by death and decay. In fact, I kind of welcome it in a weird sort of way. It's a bit comforting and morbid, according my wife, to just know that we'll be buried and help the earth and whatnot. Of course, I feel sorrow for those that die prematurely, the deaths that could have been prevented. It pains me to know that people die prematurely when it could have been stopped. I want everyone to live a long, happy, and healthy life. But again, death is inevitable. I typically work night shift, and usually it's pretty good. I mean good as in no one bothers me while I do my job. A couple of days back, I was working night shift again, doing the usual trimming, cutting, and planting, when I saw someone in the distance dressed in all black. Had it not been for the lights in the graveyard, I wouldn't have seen them at all. "Hey," I called out. The person didn't move. "Hey," I called out again. The person, a woman, turned to face me. "You're not supposed to be here." I started to walk toward her, and she walked towards me as well. It was only once she got close that I realized she was crying. "I'm sorry," she sniffled, using a hand to wipe at her nose. "It's just that my sibling is buried here, and I miss them dearly. I need to go back to where I'm from in about a month, and I just wanted to visit them to pay my respects." I eyed her with suspicion. "You couldn't have done this at an earlier hour." "Unfortunately not. I work all day, and night is the only free time I have. If you could give me directions where their gravestone is, I would appreciate it and be out of your hair." She seemed to be well kept and did seem to be telling the truth, so I relented. "Who are you looking for?" she told me, and I pointed her to the right direction. She walked off into the distance once again, and I resumed cutting grass. I didn't find it weird that she came at such a late hour. As she said, she was working, and sometimes people only had a limited amount of free time. Once I'd finished my work, I was about to leave when I heard her again. "Excuse me," the voice sounded behind me, and I turned to look at her. "Yes, I just wanted to say thank you for allowing me in and giving me directions." "Here?" She was holding out 100. I hesitated. It was no problem, really. "I'm okay." "I insist. I make around $30,000 a year. I could accept this." "Okay. Have a good night." Before I realized what was happening, she was reaching out a hand toward me, and as soon as she touched me, I blacked out. When I woke up, I was in my bed with $100 on my dresser. I figured that since I worked night shift so often, my body was tired and I must have passed out. She could have gotten my address from my phone, which I usually leave unlocked. As night fell, I took my car to the cemetery. As I drove, however, my vision blacked out again, and I saw my wife, who was currently visiting her parents, slipping and falling in the shower, and blood pooling by her head. When my vision came back, I realized I had accidentally swerved and was now driving toward a tree. I slammed on the brakes, panting. I needed to call my wife. "Yeah, baby?" Her voice answered the phone. I took that as an indicator that she was okay. "I have an odd request." "Yeah?" she asked, her voice taking on a sultry tone. "Not that kind of request, baby. Can I ask you to not get into your next shower?" She paused. I was literally about to shower. "Can I ask you to skip this one and shower tomorrow?" I asked, and she must have heard some kind of worry in my tone, because she relented. "Okay, I guess. Is everything okay?" "Everything is fine, baby. Thank you. When are you coming back?" "In 2 weeks." "I can't wait to see you." "Me too. Talk to you later." "Talk to you later." She hung up. I drove very slowly, and once I got there, I got to work once again, trimming trees, cutting grass, and the like. I didn't see the woman again. Once I had finished my shift, I drove home again slowly just in case. I was making food when my vision blacked out. This time it showed me speeding because I was late for work, and then another car hitting me and my car flipping and me crushed underneath it. I came to on the floor. I wasn't harmed physically, but my utensil had dropped. I took the bus the next day. I didn't know what was going on. Whatever it was, it definitely wasn't normal, and it seemed like it had to do with the woman I met. I went to work every single night last week, and no woman was there. Luckily, other than those two visions I had, nothing else has been happening. My wife is fine. Thankfully, she's still got one more week at her parents'. I did get another vision, though. It was about my close friend. I was on the bus when I got it, and I saw him getting into an altercation with another man. It ended up with him at the hospital. I texted him telling him to not push other people, to which he was very confused. The day after, I got a call from him saying he was in the hospital from getting into a fight with a guy trying to hit on his wife. He was stable, thank goodness, but only because he stopped himself from escalating things further. The visions kept coming, though, and so did the people I love getting hurt, or almost dead. Then came the day I knew would inevitably happen, the day that I either forgot to tell someone, or the day that someone didn't believe me. I was cooking again, then bam, vision. This time it was my ex-girlfriend. I saw her getting squished by a bus because she wasn't paying attention. She was looking at her phone in the vision. The bus came, and, well, thankfully I didn't get hurt or fall this time. I called her to tell her and she laughed me off. I mean, I get it sounds crazy, but this week I got news from her mother that she was crushed by a bus. I told her mom I tried to warn her, and I was sorry, to which her mother went on a tirade of how dare I make a joke out of this, and hung up on me. By the end of that week, I was mentally tired. All of the visions had made me stressed out. I mean, if you met a mysterious woman in a graveyard who gave you 100, made you pass out, and now you started having visions about your loved ones dying, how would you react? Yeah, thought so. My wife is supposed to return in a week, and I keep having these visions. My friends, my family, practically everyone I know is in danger, and the visions keep getting more frequent. I didn't stop. I called and still do call everyone that my vision at the time pertained to, warning them. Some listened, some didn't. Those that didn't either got seriously hurt or they die. Those that listened, thankfully, did not. But still, all of the stress had a bad effect on me. Insomnia, trying to sit down as much as possible in case I got another vision, and just overall being in a state of being down. Just because I was used to being around death doesn't mean it made the visions any easier. I went back to work this evening, eyes heavy, when I saw a familiar figure in the distance. Hey, she turned around, looking the exact same as she did 2 weeks back, and she was dressed the same too. This time she wasn't crying, and quickly walked up to me with a smile. Hello, I trust you are well. You trust I'm you think I'm. I spluttered in shock before composing myself. How the hell can I be well when whatever it is you did to me has been screwing me up for the past 2 weeks? She frowned. I do not understand. You do not like it. Of course I don't like it. I don't like seeing my friends and family die. But you call them to stop it from happening. That is a good thing. No, I felt my jaw clench involuntarily, inhaling slowly to try to calm down. I guess so. But the visions, or whatever the hell they are, they're too much. I feel so stressed and scared, and if I don't call them, they could die. It's just too much responsibility. I am sure you can handle it. You are around death always. Well, obviously, I'm not handling it too well, I snapped at her, and for a brief second I felt almost guilty for snapping at her. Just take it away. I cannot do that, she stated with no emotion. Why not? It was a gift. Gifts are not supposed to be taken back. This woman was odd. No, it's fine. You can take mine back. You've helped others with it, she reminded me. I pursed my lips. I have, yes, but I don't want to bear that responsibility for the rest of my life. I paused, a sudden idea coming to mind. Unless you want me to end up in an early grave. This time she pursed her lips. No, you have a good life ahead of you. I suppose I can and will give this gift to someone else. Would you like to keep it for a short period of time? I can visit you after and take it away then. I was going to say no, but my mind thought back to my wife, who wasn't home yet. I would. Maybe another week or so. Very well, she nodded, turning. If you ever want this gift back, just come back to this cemetery. Okay. And then I left the cemetery. I don't know if I should keep the so-called gift or not. I mean, on one hand, it does help other people. It saved most of my loved ones from getting hurt or killed. But on the other hand, it's a lot of stress and worrying to think about when the next one will appear and who I need to call. Other than that question that's been on my mind, I quit my job yesterday. Today was my last day. Oddly enough, I think I've had enough death for my lifetime. Story 2. I live in an apartment building underneath the cemetery. Rent is complicated. Don't ask me how it works. I push back Mr. Morgan's gravestone and descend the long set of stairs to the hallway where my apartment is. I'm at the very end, which would increase the sense of claustrophobia for most people. But that's not the part that really bothers me. Maybe it would be if there weren't so many other things to be horrified by. The great thing about this apartment is that I'm allowed to stay here for free. That is, I don't have to pay money at all, but I do have to do labor. You see, American culture is more fucked up than you give it credit for. I have to film things. Oh God. It is so disgusting watching the corpses go at it like horny rabbits. But I have to make sure the camera is rolling and streaming live to Brian Talbot's personal website. You wouldn't believe the market for this kind of thing, Brian tells me, and I didn't at first. Ever since I've been at the helm, though, he tells me traffic at the site has been up. You're an excellent cameraman. Keep up the good work, and you might actually get some funding on the side. Except staying here is beginning to take its toll on me for obvious reasons. However, I don't have any other options at the moment. So, between the hours of 2 to 4 p.m., I have to watch zombies screw each other's gnome brains out. Listen to the sickening sucking sounds. Make sure the camera is at the right angle. What happened after last night's session scarred me for life. I had just wrapped up another vomit-inducing shoot when I heard scratching coming from the wall separating the room the camera was in from the room I was charged with spying on. Strange, I thought. That never usually happened before. I peered through the camera lens to find a zombie's rotting face looking back at me. My heart thudded in my chest, and I grabbed it with one hand in an effort to slow it down. As soon as I managed to calm down just a little, I looked through the lens again. It appeared the two corpses were trying to shuffle out of the doorway leading into the hallway which could lead to my room. That wasn't supposed to happen. Mr. Talbot said he trained the zombies to perform and never leave the bed he provided for them. They'd keep doing this until enough of them rotted away that they died all over again. But here they were, trying to shamble out of the room. I hurried out of mine just in time to see the two zombies just standing there, eyes empty, backs hunched over. They seemed as confused as ever. One of them sort of lurched forward, which caused me to quickly grab the doorknob and slam the door shut. Something bumped up against the door, then I heard a thud on the floor. Zombies. Just as I was turning away, I saw Nina, the only other live human aside from Mr. Talbot and myself. She gave me a hesitant smile, and I waved awkwardly. I wasn't naive. I knew what services Talbot made Nina perform so that she could live here without having to pay rent. I shuddered at the thought. I had a revelation then that nothing in this grotto of sin was free. Nina gave me a final glance before she went inside her apartment. I truly felt bad for her and wished there was something I could do to help. I shook my head, trying to clear it after what I had just seen. Those walking corpses truly possessed minds of their own. Despite what Talbot said, I walked to the other end of the hall to his apartment door, hesitated before knocking. It wasn't part of my job description per se, but I figured I'd inform him of the situation. Mr. Talbot answered the door in his bathrobe, hazy-eyed, looking as if he had been doing drugs. He swayed a bit, seemed like he might topple over. He clutched something in his hand. "That a doll in your hand, Mr. Talbot?" I asked, trying to keep the humor out of my voice. The thing was covered in a red fabric with the gray X's instead of eyes. "Don't judge me, Miles. You're just a glorified camera monkey." He slurred, swayed a bit more. "All you do is film that decaying flesh. That's exactly why I'm here. I'm trying to be professional. Anyway, you said the zombies would just remain on the bed, right? Well, they almost escaped, and would have if I hadn't shut the door. What, do you want a Good Samaritan award or something? Get lost. It's just this damn doll. Got it off eBay. Controls the D-Dead," Mr. Talbot replied, then slammed the door in my face. I knew what I needed to do. I needed that damn doll. My plan was to wait for Mr. Talbot to fall asleep and then sneak into his apartment and snatch it. I figured I'd destroy it or toss it into the big pond near the border of the cemetery. Then my bizarre life could get back to normal. I tried to pass the time inside my own room by putting on my large pair of headphones and reading one of the few books I owned. Once my clock read 10 p.m., I got up and made my way to Mr. Talbot's door. He wasn't that old, But between the drinking and being an unhealthy bastard, he typically fell asleep early. I could sometimes make out his snoring all the way down the hall. I did my best to quietly pick the lock. Only took me a couple of tries. When I opened the door, I got the shock of my life. Nina sat on the small red chair opposite the bed, watching the corpses eat Mr. Talbot's body with a mixture of satisfaction and horror. One of the corpses stood up and turned its head toward mine. My throat went dry as I saw it just glare into me, but Nina only squeezed the doll, and the thing went back to its task. I just watched them eat Mr. Talbot without saying a word. Story 3. Now Nina controls this little apartment complex beneath the cemetery. I better do what she says, or I'll end up like the bloated drunkard who had been eaten to death by his undead porn actors. Undead and unpaid, I thought. Nina said she was interested in starting a business down here, something focusing on showmanship, captivating an audience, although it would be different than Mr. Talbot's vision. Maybe I'll convince perverts to meet me in the cemetery, lure them down here, and let the dead rip them to shreds. I realized then I couldn't argue with her logic. It was a sound business plan. Nina looked at me as if to say, "You better stay out of my way." Cemetery in the Bronx. My friend works as an Uber driver, and he gets a mysterious call to pick up a woman at Woodlawn Cemetery around 2:30 a.m. at night. So my friend reluctantly goes to pick this woman up, even though he finds it really weird that she wants to be picked up by cemetery at 2 a.m. My friend gets there, and sure enough, there's a woman by the front entrance of Woodlawn Cemetery. So he unlocks the door and the woman gets in the car. My friend asks the woman where does she want to go, because she gave a very general description in that app. She says she wants to go to West 168th Street. So he asks her for the building number, but all she gives him is the area code 10,452. Thinking it was weird, but at the same time okay. Whatever. She paid me. He proceeded to take her to that destination. As my friend is driving this woman to her destination, he attempts to make small talk with the woman several times. He's usually quiet, but it being late and him being a little on edge, he decides to try to get her to talk in order to calm himself down a bit. But the woman remains silent the entire ride. As they get closer to the destination, he is becoming relieved to be getting to that point where he can let the woman out of his car so he can get the hell home himself. However, as he's on the Bronx River Parkway going through exit 10, he begins to feel a tap on his shoulder. The woman finally speaks and says, "Here's your tip." He sees a $100 bill and to $20 in the woman's hand, but he declines to take it because it's a rather large sum of money, and he finds it to be too much for what was already the strangest ride he's ever had. So he declines by saying, "I appreciate it, but that's okay. You paid me on the app." The woman proceeds to say it again, "Here's your tip." My friend declines again, still keeping his eyes on the road, saying, "Ma'am, it's really okay. I can't accept that." But rather than recoiling her hand, the woman says a third time, "Here's your tip." Only her voice was completely different this time. It sounded raspy, like she had something in her throat. So my friend turns around to tell her, "Look, I appreciate it, but I can't take the money." But just as he's about to say something to her, he notices that the woman who got into his car no longer looks like the woman who got into his car. Her skin is pale white and wrinkled, her eyes are void of all pigmentation, and her clothes are dirty and tattered as if she crawled her way out of a grave. She looks like a corpse." Startled, my friend lost control of the wheel and he crashed the car into a telephone pole, blacking out. When he came to, he was in Our Lady of Mercy Hospital in a bed. He asks the attending nurse who was in the room at the time what happened, and the nurse proceeds to tell him that he was in a car accident. He then asks about the woman in the back seat. The nurse, thinking he was delirious, said that there was no woman in his car. He was the only one that was brought in from the accident, and that what he saw was probably just his mind playing tricks on him. It was around 2:45 a.m. when he crashed the vehicle. She then mentions, that this isn't the first time in her tenure as a nurse that people were brought in after crashing their car in that specific area. At first, these crashes were thought to be due to the poor shape of the bridge. So the city had work done on the bridge, but car crashes kept occurring over the years no matter how many signs were put on that particular bridge or how much work they put into it. Eventually work ceased and residents around that area stopped crossing that bridge after a certain time, believing it to be cursed. So my friend proceeds to ask about the other drivers, only to find out he is the first survivor of these crashes. Everyone else was in far worse condition than he was when he was brought in and never stabilized. They also all happened to be men. My friend was pondering why that is, because it is odd when the nurse turns and says to him while fixing his room, had it been a second or two sooner, you wouldn't have been so lucky. It's at this moment that it dawns on him that had he turned around to take the tip when the passenger first offered it, he'd be dead. The nurse, continuing the convo, proceeds to tell him about the first crash prior to the string of occurrences that happened on the bridge, as she was an attending nurse for that hospital when they first started occurring. One day a man was brought in critical condition but conscious, followed by a detective at the scene of the accident. She asked the detective what happened, and from her recollection the story goes that a woman and her husband were supposedly having a dispute over money. The man had a history of alcohol abuse which strained their marriage, and his wife barely made enough to make ends meet and wanted whatever she made to pay for his habit as well. Pissed off at him, she decided to sit in the back of the car that night of the crash, and her husband drove while under the influence. During the argument, he got pissed off and turned around to yell at her because she refused to give him the money she made in tips at her job that night. He inevitably lost control of the wheel as he turned to yell at her. She died in the crash, and he lived. When they conducted the autopsy on her, they found in her clothes a wallet with $140 in it, all she had to her name. My friend, shocked, stopped the nurse and told her that was the same amount that the woman offered me before I crashed the car. So naturally, thinking my friend was still out of it, she tells him to go back to bed, just get some rest, as my friend tries to go back to sleep, while the nurse continues preparing the room. He's watching her clean up around the area when she walks up to the vase near the door. She notices something under the vase. She picks the vase up, and at that moment she lets out this blood-curdling scream and she runs out of his room. At this point my friend is startled. He gets up and unplugs the monitor that shows his vitals, walks to where she dropped the vase, walks around the broken glass, and picks up what was under that vase. It was a card with $140 inside. Written on the card was a simple sentence that said, "Here's your tip." Story 4. I got a job working as a cemetery night watchman. I barely survived one night. In the spring of 2003, I graduated high school and had a scholarship lined up at a nearby community college. I decided to get a summer job in order to make some extra money before I started my freshman year that fall. As it happened, a friend of my dad's worked as a caretaker, a local cemetery, but was taking a couple months off in order to recuperate from some back surgery he had scheduled soon. Duke, my dad's friend, told me his son Brian, who was about my age, had already volunteered to fill in as the temporary daytime caretaker, but if I was interested, he had another job I might be interested in. I asked him what it was. He told me, night watchman. Apparently, there had been several other cemeteries in the area that had been vandalized recently, probably the work of teenagers, and Duke needed someone to guard the cemetery between 8 p.m., when it closed to the public for the day, and 5 a.m., when his son Brian would show up for his job. Duke told me it wasn't an official county position, but he was willing to pay me out of his own pocket to do it. I was a little hesitant at first to accept the job. I'm not someone who spooks very easily, but the thought of being alone in a deserted cemetery at night for 9 hours did kind of give me the creeps. But I didn't really have anything else lined up for me that summer, and it sounded like it would beat flipping burgers at McDonald's anyway, so I shrugged and said sure. Why not? The cemetery where I would be working was on the outskirts of the town where I lived, out in the country, surrounded by wide-open farmland on 3 sides. The back of the cemetery ended at the edge of a small wooded area. It was pretty big and sprawling, maybe 6 acres, and was one of the oldest cemeteries in the area, with graves dating back to the early 1800s. I drove out there one bright, warm, late afternoon in early June for my first shift, and was greeted by Duke, who was waiting for me near the entrance. He spent the next hour or so giving me a tour of the grounds and explaining what my job duties would consist of. Basically, I would give the whole cemetery a sweep every hour and write down any unusual activity or whatever that was I encountered. And if I found anyone trespassing, I shouldn't confront them. I should call the police instead. He took me into a small shed off to one side near the front. The place was crammed with tools and gardening equipment. There was a small desk with a chair and a notebook on it for me to log my reports, and a big flashlight, the long kind that takes for D batteries to power. As soon as Duke finished showing me around, his face suddenly turned serious. He told me he had something he wanted me to see and took a ring of keys out of his pocket. I watched, intrigued, as he unlocked a tall metal locker against one wall and opened it. I gasped. Inside stood a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun and a box of shells. Duke held the locker open for a few seconds to show me the shotgun, then closed and relocked it. He explained to me that the shotgun was only for extreme emergencies, and that he didn't want me to touch it unless I felt sure that my life was in danger. He went on to say that you never know who might show up at a cemetery after dark. Usually it was harmless stuff, bored kids looking for a place to drink and screw around. But cemeteries also tended to be hangout spots for all kinds of weirdos, Satanists, drug addicts, sometimes even grave robbers. Seeing my look of concern, he gave me a reassuring smile and told me it wasn't likely I would run into any of those types of people on the job, but he wanted me to know about the shotgun just in case. Then he removed the locker key from the keyring and handed it to me. By then, late afternoon had given way to early evening, and the sun had begun to set. Duke had pretty much shown me and told me everything I needed to know. So we shook hands, and then he left to go home. I watched as he got into his pickup truck and drove down the driveway and through the cemetery gate and onto the road, disappearing from sight. I realized suddenly that I was all alone in a deserted cemetery miles from anywhere, and it was starting to get dark. I shuddered in spite of myself. I looked at my watch and saw it was nearly 8 p.m., the start of my first shift. I figured there was maybe an hour of daylight left. I did my first check of the cemetery grounds, beginning at the front, the newer section, and finishing at the rear, the old section. This part of the cemetery was especially creepy. Many of the gravestones were cracked and leaning and eroded by the elements. Several of the plots had a sunken look. Duke had explained to me earlier, when giving me the tour, that this was caused by the soil settling on top of the old caskets as they deteriorated and collapsed underground. Again, I shuddered at the thought. The back of the cemetery ended at an embankment that sloped down to a shallow creek, with the woods beginning on the other side. At the bottom of the embankment was a heap of old, rotting flower bouquets and wreaths from the graves. I figure Duke must dump them there after they began to dry out and fall apart. My whole inspection only took about 15 minutes, so I headed back to the maintenance shed to kill some time before the next one. I propped my feet up on the desk and pulled out a paperback Stephen King book I had brought along to help pass the time. This was 2003. Remember, long before smartphones came along. I read, absorbed in the harrowing ordeal of the Torrance family in the creepy Overlook Hotel. And before I knew it, 9 o'clock had rolled around. I put down my book, picked up my flashlight, and headed outside to patrol the grounds. It was almost fully dark now, and I could hear crickets. I strolled through the cemetery, starting again at the front and working my way to the back, cautiously aiming my flashlight around. I had just reached the rear of the cemetery when something happened. I stopped, listening, suddenly alert. I had heard something. I cocked my head, listening. I could hear a very faint scraping sound, soft and slow and steady. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I shined my flashlight around, but could see nothing out of the ordinary. Just as abruptly as the sound had begun, it stopped. I shrugged it off, figuring it was probably some animal, a raccoon or a possum or something, scratching at the bark of a nearby tree. Finished with my inspection, I returned to the shed and picked up my book. I spent the next half hour or so reading, and was just at the part where the little boy Annie encounters the rotting naked old woman in the bathtub, when I heard something outside that caused me to jump to my feet, knocking over my chair, startled. Footsteps, slow, labored, shuffling footsteps that sounded like they were moving around just outside the shack. My heart began to race. I stood there, petrified with sudden fear. It was night time and the cemetery was closed. There shouldn't be anyone out there. I remembered what Duke had said about teenage trespassers. I waited, hardly daring to even breathe, my pulse racing, listening. The footsteps seemed to circle around the shack 2 or 3 times, then gradually faded off into the distance. Silence resumed. I waited there for several minutes, too scared to investigate. I glanced at the locker with the shotgun inside it, but remembered Duke telling me not to touch it unless I was in danger. It was probably just some local kids who came to have an underage drinking party, or a teen couple looking for a place to make out. Except the cemetery was 5 miles out of town and I hadn't heard any cars pull up outside. I stood there for the better part of 5 minutes, scared and undecisive. Finally, I told myself I was being chicken shit and needed to man up. Protecting the cemetery from trespassers was, after all, my job. It was probably some harmless old drunk or a drifter looking for a place to crash for the night. I summoned my courage, picked up the flashlight, then opened the shit door and stepped outside. It was full dark now, and totally pitch black. Thick dark clouds blotted out the moon and stars, and the only illumination came from my flashlight. Cautiously I began a sweep of the cemetery. There was no sign of any intruder, and nothing looked out of place, but I could somehow still sense that something was wrong. Different. It took a couple minutes for me to place it. It was quiet, too quiet, dead quiet. The crickets had stopped chirping. An unnatural hush had fallen over the cemetery like a blanket. The only sound was my breathing. Besides that, it was as silent as a grave. I felt like I was being watched. I had read that cliched expression in 1,000 bad horror stories, and never believed it before then, but at that moment, alone in the dark in the middle of the night, and that unnaturally silent cemetery, I did. It seemed like I could sense a dozen sets of predatory eyes boring into me, observing my every move, so strong it was almost a physical sensation. I was scared shitless. I stopped in my tracks abruptly, tensing, cocking my head. I had heard something. What was it? I listened. Faintly, I could that same soft, persistent, scraping sound from before. I looked around, trying to pinpoint its location and source. It seemed to be coming from directly ahead of me and to my right. I cautiously moved on, tracking the sound, which seemed to get slightly louder the closer I got. I was in the newer section of the cemetery, the part still in use. I stopped in front of a new grave where the sound seemed to be at its loudest. I trained my flashlight upon the marble headstone. It belonged to an elderly woman who had died only a couple weeks before. The mound of soil in front of the headstone was still brown and bare of grass from her recent burial. I listened and realized the sound was coming from below the ground. Below the grave, I felt a chill as cold as ice water rise from the pit of my stomach up to my heart. I tried convincing myself it was probably just a gopher or some other subterranean animal burrowing through the earth. Then something happened. I felt a tremor and heard the rumble of falling soil. Earthquake, I thought for a split second, but it only seemed to be coming from the fresh grave before me, nowhere else. Then the rectangle of bare, mounded earth collapsed inward, almost in slow motion, looking like the roof of an elevator car descending its shaft. It happened in no more than 5 seconds. I stood there, transfixed in shock, before a gaping black hole that only seconds before had been a full grave. It took a few moments for my brain to process what I had just witnessed. My mind was freaking out, screaming at me to run, but my body didn't listen. As scared as I was, some part of me was also curious. Some part of me had to see, seemingly not of their own accord. My feet stepped to the edge of the sunken grave, and I shined my flashlight down. The beam centered on a casket lying askew at the bottom of a pit that was at least 15 feet deep, much deeper than a grave, more like a mine shaft, with drifts of dirt all around it. And as I watched, the casket was moving, scooting along the bottom of the shaft inch by inch, scraping through the dirt. I moved the beam of my flashlight to the other end of the casket, and what I saw is something that still haunts my dreams to this day. There was a gaping black hole, the entrance of a tunnel in the side of the pit, and a pair of thin, gray arms with unnaturally long fingers, long black, claw-like fingernails were protruding from this hole, clutching the foot of the casket, dragging it into the tunnel, a little at a time. That's when I turned and ran back to the shed, panting in terror. I reached in my pocket for my phone to call the police, but it wasn't there. I must have left it on the desk in the shed. I reached the shed, went through the door, and froze. The inside of the shed was in a shambles. Everything had been trashed. Tools were scattered across the floor. The desk and chair had been turned over. My paperback had been torn to shreds, and my cell phone had been smashed to pieces. Someone had been in the shed while I'd been outside or something. I stood there, taking in the destruction. Then I heard a sound coming from behind me, the same shuffling footsteps I had heard before. I spun around. I seemed to regress in age in a matter of a few seconds, reduced to the surreal, almost wondrous state of terror of a child in the grip of a nightmare. A figure stood in front of the doorway, only a few feet outside the shed. It was cast in shadow, only a silhouette, but I could see it was tall and thin, with unnaturally long, skinny arms that hung down nearly to its feet. Its eyes were red. I could see them glinting in the dark, like embers. They were staring right at me. We stood there for what felt like eternity, regarding each other. Then the shadowy figure took a step towards the door. I darted forward, slammed the door, and turned the lock. There was an unnaturally high-pitched, chittering screech from outside, a sound more animal-like than human. The creature began to pound wildly against the shed door. I jumped as something else slammed against the rear wall of the shed. I could hear claws scratching against the wood as if something was trying to burrow through the wall. Something else slammed into the side of the shed. There were more than one of them, and they were all trying to break into the shed at the same time, trying to break in and get me. That was when I remembered the shotgun. I looked to the metal locker, still upright, but now leaning askew against one corner. I frantically searched the pockets of my jeans until I found the key Duke had given me. With shaking hands, I unlocked the locker and grabbed the shotgun, hoping it was loaded. I had never touched a gun in my life and had no idea how to load one, and there wasn't enough time anyway. I fumbled with it inexpertly for a few seconds until I figured out how to get the safety off. The banging and screeching was coming from all around me. It sounded like the shed was surrounded on all four sides. I pumped the shotgun like I'd see it done in the movies, then aimed it in my shaking hands at the door, clenched my teeth, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was louder than I ever would have imagined, and the kickback was so powerful it almost knocked me backwards. The next morning, I would find an ugly bruise on my right shoulder where the stock of the shotgun had struck me. A ragged hole the size of a fist materialized in the door. For a split second after I fired the shotgun, I thought I detected a high-pitched shriek of pain outside the shed door. Then I couldn't hear anything but a ringing in my ears. For a few seconds I feared I had gone deaf from the blast. Then slowly my hearing returned. I knew because I could hear my own ragged breathing. Otherwise there was silence. The screeching and banging had ceased. I listened intently, my heart pounding, but heard nothing. Then cautiously, still clutching the shotgun, I crept to the battered shed door, unlocked it, and threw it open. leveling the shotgun. There was nothing there but blackness. I fled the shed, running in an all-out sprint to my car, leapt in, locked the doors, started the engine, and took off, slamming down the gas pedal. I sped down the driveway, my tires shrieking and sending gravel flying. I shot through the gate, then turned onto the highway back to town. But just before I drove through the gate, I saw, or thought I saw, one last thing in my rearview mirror. Several pairs of glowing red eyes in the darkness behind my car. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. My phone had been destroyed, so I drove to the sheriff's office. When I reached town and told them I had been attacked by grave robbers, I was scared and badly shaken, but still possessed enough sense to know they wouldn't believe me if I told them what I had really encountered in the cemetery. After I gave my statement, they called my parents, who came and picked me up since I was still pretty rattled. My mom drove me home in their car, while my dad followed behind us in mine. I went straight up to my room after we got back and fell into bed, but it was several hours before I managed to fall asleep. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The state police came by the next day to ask me some questions, and I told them the same story I had told the sheriff and his deputy. I had been doing my hourly inspection of the grounds and surprised a couple grave robbers who had chased me back to the shed and tried breaking in before I had scared them away with the shotgun Duke had showed me. I hadn't gotten a good look at their faces and couldn't even tell exactly how many there had been. The police didn't seem very satisfied with my answers and looked suspicious. I think they could sense I was holding something back, but they didn't press the matter and left soon after. A couple days later, Duke stopped by the house to see how I was doing. I told him I was okay, but after my experience, I probably wouldn't be coming back to work. He seemed to understand and was apologetic about what had happened. He paid me $60 in cash for my single disastrous shift as a cemetery watchman. I noticed that something else seemed to be bothering him. He had a troubled frown on his face and seemed disturbed, maybe even a little scared. I asked him how the police investigation at the cemetery was going. There had been a brief story about it on the local TV news, and if they had found any clues, but he just shrugged and said that so far there wasn't much to go on. Somehow I could sense he was lying. His answers seemed evasive, and I got the feeling he knew more than he was letting on. He laughed, and that was the last time I ever spoke to him. It took over a week for me to get over my ordeal, but then I was pretty much back to normal. I got a job working part-time at Blockbuster Video back when that was a thing for the rest of the summer, and started college that fall. After I graduated in 2007, I got a job in the city, found a decent apartment, married, and had 2 kids. It's been 18 years since that night, and I had mostly put it behind me and forgotten about it except for the occasional bad dream. Then, last month, something happened. I had taken my family to the rural town where I grew up to visit my parents for the weekend. Just by chance I ran into Brian, Duke's son, while in town getting some groceries. He recognized me from when we had been kids. He had never really been close friends, but had attended the same schools growing up and belonged to some of the same social circles, and invited me to a bar where we reminisced about old times and caught up on each other's lives over a couple beers. His father, Duke, had died peacefully in his sleep 8 years before, and now Brian worked in his dad's position as the cemetery groundskeeper. I asked Brian if the police ever got any leads on whoever it was who had dug up the grave and attacked me that night back in 2003. His mood instantly changed. His face darkened and became guarded. He was silent for some time and seemed to be debating in his head what he should tell me. Finally, he leaned in close to me and made me promise I would never tell anyone what he was about to tell me. I promised. Brian explained that the police had inspected the open grave and discovered the tunnel I had seen at the bottom. They had investigated and discovered a whole network of underground tunnels running below the cemetery that looked to have been dug out by hand. Another tunnel entrance had been found partially concealed by undergrowth in the ditch at the bottom of the embankment in the rear of the cemetery. In the center of this subterranean tunnel system had been a large cavern that had been filled with splintered caskets, some dating back over 100 years, and bones and body parts, some still relatively fresh. The human remains had all shown signs of having been devoured. I felt a chill pass through my body. Brian finished off his beer with a hard swig and set the bottle down with a trembling hand. He went on to explain that after this gruesome discovery, the police had notified the FBI, who had shown up to investigate, and after the FBI came, another government agency had gotten involved. I asked him, but he just shook his head and told me they hadn't said, only that their jurisdiction had superseded both the state police and the FBI. They had taken over the investigation, shut down the cemetery, and had ordered everyone involved, including Duke, to stay silent with the threat of prosecution and imprisonment if they breathed a word of it to anyone. The cemetery had been closed for over a year, while men in hazmat suits had collected the bodies in plastic bags and loaded them into unmarked black vans. Then one day they were just gone. They left without a word, seemingly overnight, leaving no trace behind. The underground tunnels had been filled in with dirt. After that, things had pretty much gone back to normal. Brian sat there quietly for a while. I thought he was finished, but then he added one final detail. The morning after my night in the cemetery, after the sheriff had looked around, but before the state police had arrived to do a more thorough investigation, Brian and his dad had found something outside the shed the sheriff had overlooked, a small puddle of black liquid on the ground outside the door I had fired the shotgun through. Duke had figured it was probably just spilt motor oil from a bottle in the shed and told Brian to clean it up. But Brian had noticed something his dad hadn't. A thin trail of the same black substance in the grass leading away from the shed toward the embankment in the back of the cemetery. He had been curious and collected a small sample in a jar when his father wasn't looking and mailed it to an older cousin of his who worked as a technician in the anthropology department of a university across the state. A couple weeks later, Brian's cousin called him. They had analyzed the sample. They were able to determine it was blood, but the DNA sequence wasn't like anything they had ever seen before. They couldn't identify what the blood sample had come from. But whatever it wasn't human. Story 5. The fake cemetery on Richmond Road. Every day on my way to work, I passed the cemetery on Richmond Road. I'd always thought there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the overgrown grass, the washed-out tombstones, the fact that it was always empty, or the lack of flowers on any of the graves. I don't know exactly what it was, but whenever the bus drove by, I was left with a strange feeling in my gut. The cemetery seemed unreal somehow, like trying to look through a window only to discover was just a painting on the wall. There were no churches or mortuaries nearby, and no identifying features. Just a graveyard on its own, seemingly out of place. It wasn't until my mother's funeral a few months ago that I became compelled to look into it. See, the cemetery where she was buried, across town, so she could be with her parents, had an entire different atmosphere. It had a sort of weight to it, a weight that the cemetery on Richmond Road lacked. It was the difference between being alone in a crowd and being alone in a house. Even when I returned to the gravesite on my own, the cemetery still had a presence of sorts, almost as though it was buzzing with life, whereas the one on Richmond Road felt stale, clinical, and sterile. I started asking around at work. My curiosity only grew when I realized nobody knew anyone who'd been buried there, not even distant relatives. The mystery quickly became an obsession of mine, a burning curiosity that couldn't be quelled unless I knew the truth. I would have to dig deeper to find it. My first step was to consult the records at City Hall. According to official documents, the cemetery land was in an industrial zone. Unlike the community cemeteries, which were marked as urban services zones, my next step was to find out who owned the land. Unfortunately, I couldn't gather any information on its current owners. I tried researching who originally bought it, but the graveyard's inception predated the available records. My final step was sorting through decades of city maps, hoping to come up with a timeline for the graveyard's construction. If I could narrow down when it was established, I could focus my research. Pre-60s era maps identified it as a forested area, while post-60s era maps had it blocked off entirely. For all intents and purposes, the graveyard shouldn't have existed. One evening, when my curiosity boiled over, I wandered into the graveyard. You could say that I broke in, but the gate wasn't locked and I didn't see a keep out sign. As I strolled through the unkempt rows of tombstones, I realized something. They were identical, save for the names on the front. Same size, same rate of decay, same type of marble. They were spaced out in identical, perfectly aligned rows, all factors that contributed to the graveyard lacking a touch of human warmth. The most chilling detail, however, had to be the year etched on their polished surfaces. Every single one was marked 1965, leading me to wonder if I was standing in some sort of war monument. But the era was wrong. What did this mass grave signify? I can't quite explain why, but as I stood in the graveyard with only the sound of the frigid wind to keep me company, I couldn't help but think the graves I was standing on were empty. In my mind, I could picture hundreds of caskets, their silk linings still in pristine condition, and their pillows plump and untouched. A strange thought, perhaps, but one I couldn't shake. It was then that I saw a spade resting against a nearby tree. Rust circled up the shaft like climbing vines, eating away at the metallic green paint on its surface. The spade had been left out in the elements for too long, I figured. Eyed it for a long moment, unable to make up my mind. I was alone. I had the opportunity to prove my theory. All these months, no, years of unanswered questions, and I finally had a chance to get to the bottom of them. My fingers wrapped around the handle. I pulled the spade over my head and glared at the foot of the nearest grave. My body tensed, my heart raced. Could I really do it? I was trembling, shaking in my boots. I hadn't even done anything yet, but I was already drowning with guilt and regret. What was I doing? What was I expecting to find buried beneath the ground? I was sickened by my own morbid thoughts and actions. This obsession had to end. How could I have let it get this far? I lowered my arms, took a step back, and hung my head in shame. I didn't have time to dwell on the shame for too long. Footsteps broke through the silence of the night. I could feel blood draining from my face as I froze where I stood. Had the cops come to arrest me for trespassing? I wanted to run, but I was afraid I'd get into even more trouble if I did. I knew someone was bound to get curious eventually, said a calm voice. I reflexively clutched the spade tightly and held it against my chest as I turned around to face the speaker. There was an old man peering at me. He was wearing a knitted sweater, brown pants, and tattered black shoes. The crow's feet around his eyes stretched as he smiled softly. "You're curious about the grave, right?" he murmured, motioning towards the plot. I stared at him, speechless. I'd been caught with my hand in the cookie jar and didn't quite know how to explain myself. There was no lie in the world that could properly justify my actions. My face twisted as I racked my brain trying to come up with a response, but my thoughts fluttered away in every direction like dandelion fuzz in the breeze. "Well, don't just stand there," he said, motioning for me to come closer. Shivering, I blindly obeyed and bridged the distance between us. He smiled and looked me in the eyes. "Come, let's get you warmed up with some coffee. I'm sure you must have questions." My fingers squeezed the spade protectively. I shyly averted my gaze from the stranger and lowered my head closer to my shoulders, trying to make myself smaller. "Not much of a talker, are you?" he asked, letting out a soft chuckle. He extended his arm towards the back of the property, where I could just barely make out the outline of a building. "Come on now, don't be shy." Still looking away, I loosened my grip and inched towards the tree. I placed the spade right back where I'd found it. As soon as I let go, it toppled over. I reached down to grab it, but felt a hand on my shoulder to stop me. "It's fine, just leave it. Come on, I promise I won't bite." He didn't sound sinister. His voice was calm, warm, and welcoming. He was the embodiment of a grandfather, but still something put me ill at ease. Was it him, or the shame and disgust I was feeling at myself? His hand moved from my shoulder to my back. I felt him push against it very lightly, like a parent guiding their child. I found myself walking along, unable to speak or look at anything but my own defeat. "I'll explain everything once we get inside," he assured me. He led me to a concrete building at the very outskirts of the cemetery. Though the outside was cold and unwelcoming, the inside had a homely feel to it. There were couches, an old television, and a bed in the corner. It almost looked like a hunter's cabin, minus the shotguns and animals' hides. On the bookshelf in the corner was a large frame photo of half a dozen people wearing lab coats. It had to have been quite old, judging by its grainy texture, lack of color, and the outdated hairstyles of the men and women photographed therein. "Have a seat. I'll be right back," he said. He disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me to meander around the living room. I could have run away at that point, but I was paralyzed. mortified by what I'd done. I could hear the sounds of a coffee maker gurgling from the other room and ceramic cups clanging against one another. "Do you take anything with your coffee? Sugar, milk, cream?" he asked as he returned with a fresh cup. "SHSH, sir." The words wouldn't come out. I swallowed and cleared my throat. "S sugar, please." He clapped his hands together and chuckled. "So he speaks." My cheeks flushed red with embarrassment. He handed me the cup of coffee. "Name?" "Isaiah." Odd name for someone so young. My mother was religious. "You know?" "Tell me, do you believe in the soul?" "No." He smiled a knowing smile. "So tell me, Isaiah, what were you doing digging up the grave?" My heart stopped. It was the question I was dreading. I should have spent my time coming up with an answer, but I didn't. My mind had gone blank from the moment I'd seen him to the moment he placed the cup of coffee in my hands. "Well?" he insisted. I tried to take a sip of coffee to buy some time, but it was still scalding hot. "I had a hunch that it'd be empty," I answered. He took a seat opposite from me and smiled again, nodding his head as though he'd anticipated the answer. "What if I told you that you were right? Am I?" He nodded. "Are they all empty? The graves, I mean?" I asked. I figured he knew. He lived on the property. After all, he nodded. "Every last coffin." Do you want to know why I hesitated? Did I? Was this one of those things like in the movies where he'd tell me he was going to have to kill me if he told me the truth? I tensed, fingers digging into my kneecaps nervously. He laughed lightheartedly. "You shouldn't be so afraid of me, you know. I'm not the one digging up graves in the middle of the night," he said. "Touché. Please tell me," I finally requested. He leaned back against the chair, settling in like a storyteller, preparing to weave a fantastic tale for his children. "It all started back in the 60s. When he cupped a hand to his chin and squinted at me. I'd say about your age. I was working with a team of medical researchers on improving organ transplantation. You see, back then, transplants were still fairly new. We weren't sure which organs could and couldn't be successfully transplanted." I took a sip of coffee, listening to him attentively. I wondered where he was going with this. Was he a mad scientist who disemboweled his victims just to see if he could? Would I be next? He looked longingly towards the photo on the shelf. It was while researching the brain that we realized something that brought our research to a complete standstill, something that shook us to the core of our foundation. We discovered the brain lives on, even after death. I snorted, but quickly slapped my hand over my mouth. "I am so sorry. That's just not what I was expecting to hear." I pressed my lips together. "I'm sorry, but what you're saying is impossible." He shook his head. "It's all right. I understand your skepticism. I was skeptical to back then, but it's true. We discovered life after death, so to speak, in the form of electrical impulses, barely noticeable, really. Even days after a body has died, the brain still sends out just the faintest of signals. You almost have to be looking for it to know it's still there. But it is." His smile faded into a solemn frown. "And the brain continues to do so until it putrefies completely." I became overwhelmed with apprehension. I didn't quite understand what he was trying to say, but the mere thought of it made me uncomfortable. The hairs on my forearm stood at attention. A bead of sweat rolled down my temple and landed on my lap. I swallowed a knot in my throat, like a chicken running with its head cut off. All right, he shook his head. No, that's completely different. Those are just the nerves still firing at random. What we found was, he paused, trying to come up the right word, organize, deliberate messages sent through the brain, signals that are much slower and with a living specimen and much less active, but still present. When you die, your brain is still aware of what's going on. His faded blue eyes looked into mine. Despite his age, I could see vitality behind their cloudy facade. I looked away, unable to maintain eye contact. My gaze fell on the brown liquid in the cup between my fingers. He continued, the brain is aware of everything. Do you understand what that means? I thought of the caskets in the graveyard. I was starting to understand why they were empty. Even autopsies? I asked hesitantly. He brought his hands together and nodded. We cut them open like it's nothing, without realizing what we're doing. But if that wasn't bad enough, he started, his voice becoming sharper, we extend their suffering. The brain, under normal circumstances, should decay within a few days, but we chill our corpses. We embalm them so we can put them on display. We lock them up in caskets and bury them deeper in the ground. Nowadays, brains can survive weeks, sometimes even a month, longer than they should. It goes against the natural order of things. I felt ill. If he was right, if he wasn't just some crazy old coot, then I could only imagine the kind of horrors people had endured. Could they feel their bodies being cut open, embalming fluid flushing their system, and their skin being sewn and prepped for viewing? How long did they feel the four walls of their caskets close down around them before they finally found rest? He had to be wrong. He just had to be. There's no way, I murmured tensely. He sighed. I know it's hard to believe, but it's the truth. We were all shocked. We didn't want to believe it. We performed countless tests, but we all came to the same conclusion. We couldn't do much, though, only destroy the bodies set to us. Make sure none of them suffered. What about all the graves? He smiled. Those are symbolic. The families know no one's buried there. We were working with bodies donated to science. The graveyard was just to give families a place to mourn and collect themselves. But since most of our specimens came from out of town, well, no one ever really bothered coming to the graveyard after the funerals. He explained. The plots were empty, after all. Why make the trip? What about everyone else? The ones who weren't sent to you? Everyone's who's been buried since then? I asked. My leg began to tremble from nervous agitation as I worried about my mother, who'd been buried recently. If you're right, then that's well and good. But what about the millions of people who still get buried every year? His gaze softened. We did everything we could. We reported our findings, omitting a few details, of course. Wouldn't want to cause a panic or worse, have our funding cut. We did help initiate long-term results. It's no coincidence that fewer and fewer people get buried nowadays, you know. Cremation is becoming common practice, but you know how bureaucracy goes. Like most things, change takes time. I sat there, head in my hands, staring at the floor, while the cup of coffee cooled on the table next to me. Why tell me this? I asked. I didn't want to know. Why would anyone want to know? I could hear him shuffling in his seat. He got up, walked to the bookshelf in the corner, and grabbed the photograph. I told you out of selfishness, he answered. You see, my fellow researchers died one after the other, leaving me as the only man alive who knows the truth. He knelt down in front of me so our eyes could meet. I'm getting along in years now. It won't be long before I'm dead and gone. I don't want to suffer. I need someone to take care of me when the time comes. Please, I need you to destroy my brain." I stood up, shaking. What? No, I'm not. I'm not a killer." He laughed nervously and shook his head. "No, not right now. When I die, please. I put it in my last will and testament. But I know how these things go. They won't destroy the brain. They'll cremate me eventually, but not quickly enough." He grabbed my legs tightly and looked up at me, his calm and controlled behavior suddenly desperate and panicked. "Please, I'm begging you. I don't have any living relatives. Let me mark you as a next of kin. They'll let you in, then you can do it. Please, I don't want to suffer while I wait to be cremated. I don't want to feel the fires melting my skin." I didn't know what to say or do. What he was asking for was inhuman, but I had a feeling he wouldn't let go unless I agreed. I nodded hesitantly. "All right." His grip loosened instantly. He let out a sigh of relief and pushed himself to his feet. I could see him wiping his eyes on his sleeve. Had he actually started crying? Good. "I'll just take down your information," he said, waddling to the kitchen for a pen and paper pad. "I know what you must be thinking. Why didn't I just give him fake info?" Truth is, I was so frazzled that I reacted automatically. I gave him my address, phone number, and name. Everything. When I was done, I left. I wandered out of the graveyard, feeling shaken to the core. I hoped what he'd told me was a delusion. I hoped he'd fade away to the back of my mind, and that I'd never get a call about him. I went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling for hours, imagining decaying bodies trapped in their dark tombs, able to hear and feel, but unable to see anything or call for help. A fate worse than being buried alive. No one knew the pain they were in. They couldn't scream or scratch at the surface. They'd just lay there and feel themselves withering away. The chilling imagery kept me up well into the morning hours. Even after convincing myself that the old man was crazy, the anxiety persisted. The fear was electric, tingling at the back of my neck like someone blowing on my skin. I couldn't get the morbid thoughts out of my mind. They ate away at me like acid rain on an old swing set. And then the phone rang. I picked it up and brought it to my ear. "Hello? Is this Isaiah Brown?" "Why, yes," I replied nervously. Had the old man reported me to the police for grave robbery? Were they going to arrest me? "This is the Richmond Hospital. You were marked as an emergency contact for your great-uncle. He was taken to the hospital early this morning. We're going to need you to come in." My stomach dropped. As far as I knew, I didn't have a great-uncle. It had to have been the man from the night before. Never in my wildest dreams did I expect to be notified of his death, especially not so soon. I should have refused to go, but something in me compelled me to comply. Less than half an hour later, I arrived at the hospital. A nurse informed me that my great-uncle had passed away. She led me to his bedside and left me there, closing the door behind her. Judging by the cleanliness of the room, it seemed as though his stay at the hospital hadn't been too chaotic. At least, there was only a crash cart in the corner and a few discarded tools as proof that he'd received treatment. I unhooked the chart hanging over the foot of his bed and read it. His name was Herbert Jones. He died at the age of 81 from heart failure. A sinking feeling in my gut told me it wasn't coincidental. Herbert had been waiting for someone like me to come along. Had he offed himself once he'd passed on his final request? I stood in front of him, and stared at his lifeless body, wondering if there was any truth to what he'd told me the night before. He lay there, dead as a doorknob, eyes foggy, blank stare locked on the ceiling. But as I leaned closer and really looked into his hazy eyes, I saw something. A light, a faint sparkle of life beyond his faded irises. It was like looking into a frost-covered window on a cold winter's night, and just barely seeing the outline of a family around the fireplace. Something you'd never see unless you knew to look. Was this why people usually closed the eyes of the departed? I staggered back, a chill spreading from my extremities to my heart, clutching it in a vice-like grip. I understood what I had seen, what Herbert had been talking about, the conclusion he'd tried to lead me to. I had seen his soul. Herbert was right. He was dead, but his soul hadn't left his body. It was trapped inside of him, waiting to be freed, waiting for me to free it. Hesitantly, I reached for a scalpel left behind on the tray next to his bed. I reared my arm back and stared at his head, my target. I was shaking like a leaf. Destroy the brain, I whispered to myself, in shock. The words were horrifying, the kind of words reserved for zombie movies. The instrument felt heavy in my hand, or perhaps it was the weight of responsibility that weighed it down. I wish I could say that I respected Herbert's final wishes, but I'd be lying if I did. I was too afraid of the consequences. What if a nurse walked in and caught me? What if I missed? What if the sound of his brain sloshing against the walls of his cranium haunted me for the rest of my life? I dropped the scalpel and ran out of the room, my stomach a mess of knots, my heart a cage, lion roaring to escape. Herbert put his faith in me, and I let him down. I let the hospital perform their autopsy, and God knows what else. I just pray they cremated him at least.